Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, thank you very much for this most kind invitation. At the very beginning, I would like to say how grateful I am for the organizers, for the Lisbon conference, friends of mine, for the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation, and first and foremost to a very dear friend whom I can not say no to. This is my former colleague, former Foreign Minister of Portugal, Luís Amado. We served together at some very difficult times in the respective positions of our country's foreign ministers, and that was the time when we built such friendship that it was very, very difficult to say no after Luís Amado called me. And it's difficult to say no to Luís Amado in a wider context, him having secured a position as one of the foreign policy elders of this part of the world. And this is something that I came here to with that in mind. My address is going to be somewhat different from the ones that we've had a privilege to hear before, because I'm not a development expert. And it'll be very, very difficult to get into the gist of what such experts have spoken before me. But I did have some touch with development in parts of my career. Well, at school, it had to do something with development, but much more, it was much more related to my year in office as president of the United Nations General Assembly in its 67th session. And it wasn't premeditated, and I didn't really have the idea that I'll have to do so much with development, and let alone sustainable development at the time. But my election for president coincided with the Rio Plus 20 conference. It was actually just 1 month apart, those two events. And rather unexpectedly, the Rio Plus 20 landed into the General Assembly the responsibility for putting together the post-2015 development agenda. Mind you, this is something very different conceptually from the way that the Millennium Development Goals have been put together. It was a different era. The year 2000 was very, very different from the year 2012. And the Millennium Development Goals, which most people believe are a success story, have been just put together and imposed on the member states of the United Nations. But the year 2012 was a very different year. So many things have happened in those 12 years. And the only way to agree on a Rio Plus 20 document was to give the responsibility for conceiving and formulating the Sustainable Development post-2015 agenda, was to give it to the General Assembly. And General Assembly is, believe me, a rather difficult animal to handle. It's very diverse. It actually represents the whole world. And indeed, the whole world comes from all different angles when it comes to debates in the General Assembly. However, it was just impossible to conceive a debate in the plenary of such a complex issue as how to make development sustainable and conceptualize it within goals in only 3 years in such a diverse environment. So I basically ended up spending most of my time as president of the General Assembly negotiating the negotiation mechanisms. And a lot of people believe that this was not going to be possible, that in the end we should just, go and then try in the old Millennium Development Goal ways to work behind the scenes, then have some piece of paper, and then push it and press it and make it somehow be adopted in the United Nations General Assembly. However, in the very first few months of the 67th session of the General Assembly, it became obvious that it was not going to work. And that countries were very, very serious about saying, no, we are going to be the ones defining what is sustainability for us. Because sustainability for somebody who lives in the west coast of the United States probably looks very different to what sustainability is for somebody in Bangladesh or in sub-Saharan Africa, or Western Europe for that matter. However, we ended up creating these groups and mechanisms. And there is some progress right now. I'm trying to follow what's going on in the United Nations. I'm trying to follow what's going on in the General Assembly. My good friend Sam Kutesa, who is the 69th president of the General Assembly, is doing a great job overviewing the work of the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development. This is the group that is supposed to propose the post-2015 goals to adoption to the next Summit of Leaders. But this year, 2015, is not only the year of defining the post-2015 development agenda. It's also a year where two other important but very related processes are also coming to an apex. And one is the financing for development, and the conference on that is going to take place in Addis this July. And perhaps most crucially, and in my opinion most pressingly, there's going to be a COP21 summit on climate change in Paris at the end of this year. So you have these three big multilateral processes coming together to a single point of climax in the year that is ahead of us. And this is somehow all supposed to be correlated, coherent, part of the same whole. And it was very, very cleverly thought. The big question is, can it really work in practice? And I'd like to share with you some of my experiences when it comes to the practicing of diplomacy related to development as President of the General Assembly. Well, first of all, people who are supposed to adopt all these goals, they're representing the governments of their countries in the United Nations. They're ambassadors and below. Well, Louis knows, and as a former foreign minister, when you would send somebody to represent your country in the United Nations, your first and foremost set of tasks would be related to the peace and security of your part of the world and beyond. So you have a heavily dominated group, heavily dominated by hard security experts. And then all of a sudden, this is the group of people who you need to explain these very complex and very, very sophisticated arguments that, for example, we have just heard. To be very honest, it just passes by a lot of people. 95% of ambassadors and their assistants and aides in the United Nations, and I'm talking about country representatives, they're much more worried about what's going on in the Security Council. They're much more worried about what's going on in for example, now Iraq and with the fight with ISIS. They're much more worried about what's going on right now in Ukraine than about all of these things that we had debated. And I am currently running a think tank that is called Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development. Again, I am not an expert in sustainable development. I am just a big believer that there will be no sustainability of development unless we tie it efficiently with the international relations, because this is the only way in which you can bring everybody seriously together. And when I mean seriously together, I mean heads of states and government of all these countries to then push for all these noble goals. And it's not easy these days, because this era is the era of the great return of geopolitics back to the international scene. It's the 100th anniversary this year of a very big conflict that broke out, unfortunately, in my part of the world, in the Balkans. I'm referring to the outbreak of the First World War. But the situation is, in many ways, scaringly similar to the situation that we've had about 100 years ago. And I'll just give you one example. And not everybody's aware of it. And actually, I would say that the vast majority of population, at least in the part of the world where I come from, is aloof about the possibility of a global conflict in the 21st century. I'll tell you one short story. In the year 1914, the best-selling book in the world was printed in London, was sold in London. It was called The Illusion of War by Norman Angell, in which he made a very authoritative argument that because of the vast advancement in technology, especially communication technology, he was referring obviously to telephone and telegraph, and also the growing, intertwining economic interest of key political players, and many, many other arguments. But his conclusion was that there will be no world war in the 20th century because it just doesn't make sense. And that was the world's best-selling book in February 1914. Now, fast forward 100 years down the road, and there's this very big and famous annual gathering of world leaders in many fields. It's called World Economic Forum, Davos. And literally everybody who's anybody is, coming to Davos and talking about big strategic things. And then Davos also prints out every year in January the book of risks for the year that is coming. Well, check out the book of risks for 2014. It does not contain the word Ukraine. So things come overnight, things happen overnight. And then all of a sudden, most of the energy is sucked into a different direction. So is it Ukraine? Is it the Middle East? Is it something that tomorrow in the Far East may all of a sudden break up? A lot of people are worried about the Far East, in particular when it comes to peace and stability. And perhaps the last few months were slightly better, with slightly better news coming from that part of the world. But still, it's a very explosive area. Now, this is the real set of circumstances in which the world leaders will have to agree by the end of this year on the climate compact, sustainable development goals, and how to finance development in the context of these goals in the 21st century. And I'm an optimist that some kind of an agreement is going to be reached. I'm an optimist for Paris because the United States and China are for the first time actually pursuing and trying to find a deal. I'm also expert about the Sustainable Development Goals because I now know the atmospherics, the wider atmospherics in the General Assembly. I'm not sure how optimistic I am about financing for development and what is going to take place in Addis, but something's going to be put down on paper, probably in the hope that no pledges will ever have to be fulfilled. But we are going to have some kind of an agreement by the end of 2015. Big multilateral piece of paper. Actually 3. Then you would need to put them together. But I think that the key challenge for the period after 2015 is actually going to be whether or not there's going to be a strength in the international community to follow up on what was agreed and put down in the Code of Conduct. And there, I think, and this is perhaps the parting thought, the thought with which I'm going to end my remarks, We need a common multilateral organization of undisputable legitimacy, that it is going to demonstrate leadership, global leadership, in fulfilling this agenda. And for better or for worse, there is no other organization that we have right now in the world except the United Nations. Now, my experience when it comes to high-level representatives of countries with regard to the United Nations is that they fall into two broad categories. The group of people who believe that the United Nations matter, and those who believe that they don't. And there's a very large group of those who believe that they don't. Perhaps bigger than you would expect or would wish to accept. But my strong opinion is that the future relevance of the United Nations is intimately related to how seriously the United Nations are going to engage with respect to fulfilling the agreements, the big agreements, big noble agreements put in a piece of paper, which we are going to have by the end of next year. And the relevance of this organization, the big test of the 21st century relevance of this organization is actually going to be intimately related to how efficient they are in following them up. And I happen to personally believe that unless we do take them seriously, and especially the Climate Change Compact, the life is going to look very different on this planet in the not too distant future. And the kind of planet that we're going to leave to those who come after us is going to be incomparable to what we have been blessed to enjoy until now. I thank you for your attention.